It wasn't a sudden twist of fate, it wasn't a mere fluctuation in global oil prices, it wasn't even the result of external sanctions or foreign interference, it was a deliberate structural dismantling of checks and balances. This was done in favor of centralized command. The pattern is unmistakable. The arithmetic is merciless. History does not stutter. It follows a precise mechanical sequence. When a state decides that political will can override economic reality, the outcome is fixed. The timeline may stretch, the specific actors may change, but the trajectory from consolidation to confiscation is absolute. We are witnessing a profound shift in the North American economic architecture. The signals coming from south of the Rio Grande are flashing red. But to understand the gravity of the current data, you must first understand the mechanism of the collapse. You must understand that what looks like national sovereignty often masks the onset of solvency failure. This is not a political accusation. It is a forensic accounting of a recurring historical event. The destruction of a currency and an economy begins long before the hyperinflation arrives. It begins when the law becomes an instrument of the treasury. It begins when the energy sector becomes a piggy bank for the regime. It begins when the rational move for capital is to leave. The incentive structure is clear. When a government cannot tax enough to cover its promises, it must seize. It seizes through inflation. It seizes through regulation. It seizes through the nationalization of industries. We have seen this play out with devastating precision across three distinct eras. The geography changes. The underlying equation does not. Consider the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. This is the archetype of the pattern. The crisis did not begin with barbarians at the gate. It began with the budget in Rome. Specifically under the rule of Diocletian and his predecessors, the empire faced a critical funding gap. The costs of the military and bureaucracy exceeded the tax base. The solution was not to cut spending. The solution was to debase the currency. The silver content of the denarius was systematically reduced. It went from nearly pure silver to a copper coin washed in a thin layer of silver. By the time Diocletian issued his edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, the currency was essentially worthless. Think about the mechanic here. The state decreed that prices must stay low. While they flooded the market with bad money, the penalty for violating the price controls was death. The result was not stability. The result was that goods vanished, merchants refused to sell, farmers refused to bring grain to the city. The economy bifurcated into a visible state economy that didn't work, and a hidden black market that did. A Roman soldier in this era found his pay increased nominally, but his purchasing power obliterated. The middle class, the decurions, were taxed into oblivion. They abandoned their posts and flight to the countryside began. The complex trade networks of the Mediterranean disintegrated because the medium of exchange had been weaponized by the state. Just like Rome, the breakdown of property rights accelerates collapse today. Look at Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. The narrative often focuses on the final stage of hyperinflation, the famous $100 trillion note, but the structural rot began years earlier with land reform. The government of Robert Mugabe did not just redistribute land, it destroyed the legal title to the land. This is the critical distinction. Land is collateral. When the state declared that title deeds could be nullified, the banking system's foundation evaporated. Banks could no longer lend against farms because the collateral was politically vulnerable. Credit vanished, production collapsed. Zimbabwe went from being the breadbasket of Africa to a net importer of food almost overnight. The incentive for the political elite was to secure loyalty through patronage. The cost was the annihilation of the productive economy. By 2008, the inflation rate was estimated in the sextillions, but the daily reality for a citizen was simpler and more brutal. It was empty shelves, it was the total absence of fuel, it was a barter economy where a loaf of bread cost a specific weight of gold dust or US dollars. The government blamed speculators, they blamed shopkeepers, they blamed foreign powers. But the math showed the central bank was printing money to pay the army to prevent a coup. The destruction of property rights made currency destruction inevitable. Just like Zimbabwe, the seizure of the energy sector is critical. This brings us to the most direct parallel. Before the crisis, Venezuela was the wealthiest nation in South America. It sat atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. The collapse was not caused by a lack of resources, it was caused by the politicization of the state oil company. In the early 2000s following a strike, the administration fired over 18,000 skilled engineers and managers. They replaced them with political loyalists. The incentive was to remove opposition and gain total control. The result was that technical expertise left the country. Production began a slow terminal decline. Instead of reinvesting profits into maintenance and exploration, the state drained accounts to fund social programs and buy support. When oil prices dipped, the buffer was gone. The government began printing bolivars to cover the deficit. They imposed strict capital controls. They set fixed exchange rates that bore no resemblance to reality. By 2016, the supermarkets were empty. The middle class found themselves foraging for food. The flight of human capital was staggering. Millions of Venezuelans walked across borders to escape. The state blamed an economic war, but the data showed reality. They had consumed their own seed corn. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is the era of stability and sound money. Stage 2 is overextension, where promises exceed taxation. Stage 3 is the turning point of debt monetization. Stage 4 is the appearance of inflation initially dismissed. Stage 5 sees the implementation of price and capital controls. Stage 6 is the flight of capital and black markets. Stage 7 is the collapse and reset. Just like Venezuela, Mexico is exhibiting classic warning signs. Mexico is transitioning from Stage 3 into Stage 4. The parallels are not exact, but the direction is unmistakable. Current data suggest a profound concentration of power. This echoes the early Chavez era. Recent judicial reforms threaten to dismantle legal independence. If a judge owes their position to a political party, the rule of law becomes the rule of the party. This is the same mechanism that eroded rights in Zimbabwe. Furthermore, the state's handling of Pemex is alarming. Pemex is the most indebted oil company in the world. Rather than restructuring or inviting private capital, the government has doubled down on state control. They prioritize energy sovereignty over economic viability. The government has absorbed billions in Pemex debt. This transfers liability to the sovereign balance sheet. This puts the Mexican peso directly in the line of fire. Critics argue that the super peso has been strong recently. However, if institutional checks continue to erode, the risk premium on Mexican assets will skyrocket. The incentive for the ruling party is to maintain popularity. They do this through cash handouts funded by deteriorating fiscal positions. The risk is that capital will flee north. This triggers the very crisis the controls are meant to prevent. There is a counterargument to this grim assessment. Proponents argue Mexico benefits from decoupling from China. They point to record foreign direct investment and manufacturing. They argue state control is necessary for national security. This view relies on the assumption the U.S. needs Mexico. However, the arithmetic of debt cares little for geopolitical hopes. Even if factories are built, they require reliable electricity. Mexico has struggled to provide stable power to industrial zones. If the legal framework collapses, factories can be nationalized. The rational move for global capital is to exit entirely. The sheer weight of Pemex debt creates structural fragility. No amount of nearshoring narrative can fix this. The endgame follows a fixed order. First, we see a controlled decline. This is where we are likely heading with Mexico. The currency weakens gradually. Inflation runs hotter than the U.S. The government uses soft capital controls to keep money in. We saw this in Britain during the 1970s. If structural issues are not addressed, this slides into chaos. This is the Venezuela scenario. Hyperinflation takes hold. The official exchange rate becomes fiction. The economy dollarizes spontaneously on the street. Finally, there is the reset and restructure. This usually involves a new currency and a default. Mexico experienced this in the tequila crisis of 1994. The risk is that the current trajectory is more structural. The only variable is timing and pain. For those in the U.S., implications are severe: migration waves, supply chain disruptions, and trade loss. For the individual, the lesson is to look past rhetoric. Watch the institutional foundations. Subscribe to channels that track the flow of capital. Do not just watch the flow of news. Build resilience by diversifying your exposure. Never rely on any single jurisdiction. Pay attention to the data. History is a map. We are walking a well-trodden path. The signs are there for those willing to look. Do not be caught unprepared when the music stops. Protect your assets before the gates close. Understand the signals of the invisible tax. The collapse is a process, not an event. You have the time to prepare if you act now, stay vigilant, stay liquid, and watch the arithmetic, not the politicians.